In the 2 weeks since the Nigerians took to the street to rally against police brutality, social media from users around the world tweeted out their support for Nigeria using the hashtag #EndSARS. Police brutality, military overreach, corruption, and more have been issues in Nigeria for decades, where much of the ruling class, often supported by some people in the West, are suspected beneficiaries of the overreach.
Host of the Low Society podcast, Angie Speaks, says that while the issue is very complicated, the EndSARS movement highlights the fact that police brutality is embedded in class relations. And here to elaborate on her thoughts on this and much more is podcast host and YouTuber Angie Speaks. It's so great to have you on, Angie.
Good to see you, Angie.
Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Can you just set up for us what has been going on in Nigeria and why has it sparked this global outcry?
So SARS has been around since 1992, and it's a subdivision of the Nigerian police force. It stands for the Special Anti-Robbery Unit, and armed robbery has been a massive problem in Nigeria since the post-colonial era. It's been an ongoing issue, and a lot of people have been pouring out against this really big problem in the country, and the government responded by setting up SARS. But unfortunately, it exacerbated the problem because a lot of the police are not paid well. The departments are underfunded. The government housing they have is also incredibly poor. So they resort to extorting the public in order to make up for what they're not getting from their salaries and their positions. And of course, they have a monopoly on violence that the average citizen does not. So they're able to use that in order to extract profit from citizens. It's a very common, very, very common problem. And they've sort of become the armed robbers that they were set up to be a deterrent for, unfortunately. It's deeply embedded in class struggle and in what's going on in the country, especially because a lot of expats are moving back to Nigeria now, people who are part of the diaspora. People who, like me, who grew up in places like England and America, who are now moving back to Nigeria to seek business opportunities. And because they're quite conspicuous, they're often targeted by police. And since this demographic is more moneyed and has more exposure and is more savvy in terms of things like social media, they were able to sort of bring a lot of attention to this issue. But it's a shame that the issue got attention as soon as it started to affect people who come from a higher class background.
So that is very interesting, which is that this has always been a problem in Nigeria for everybody. And it was only until rich expats started getting extorted that people started to care. Could you dive into that dynamic a little bit?
Yes, it's very common. I mean, I've experienced it, and you don't necessarily have to be rich, but anybody who sort of looks conspicuously from the West. There's a term that people use to describe them. They're called aje butter, which literally means eaters of butter. It's sort of it's a derogatory term that's used to sort of describe those of us who come from the West. And there's a massive class divide between the people from the West and the indigenous population, even though obviously we share cultural background, heritage, language, all of these different aspects. However, the class background is incredibly conspicuous, and the majority of the incidents that sparked social media outrage were things like luxury SUVs being stolen, for instance, or police specifically targeting people who look more Western or look more kind of integrated into that culture than they do into the average culture. So yeah, there's a huge sort of class dynamic to the things that are going on that has sort of gone unexplored in terms of what you see covered in the mainstream media.
Yeah, and part of what the spark was here, obviously, was the fact that protesters were killed in the street by the police. That's part of what sparked the global outcry here. What has the reaction been on the ground in the country?
So the government has actually responded to the calls to end SARS. And Buhari has actually talked about SARS being disbanded in response to the outpouring of protests that have happened. However, the protesters and the movements behind them have a list of demands that they've set up because this obviously runs a lot deeper than just SARS. It's an overall issue with government corruption and lack of funding in the public sector. There's a huge issue. There's a huge issue in terms of the private sector in Nigeria. Everything from electricity to, roads, everything is sort of kind of foisted off to private individuals to take care of, or the private sector. And this is just sort of a continuation of that trend when the police are underfunded and when they have no recourse in terms of economic stability. Oftentimes they turn to extortion of the public. And Nigeria also has a history of military dictatorship. Buhari himself is a military man that transitioned into a civilian position. And this sort of violence is something that's been incredibly commonplace in the country for decades. It's only just sort of starting to touch the expats, the sort of moneyed middle class, now that they're coming back into the country after being in the West and seeing things like Black Lives Matter, seeing those protests happen, and then going back to Nigeria and seeing even worse brutality occurring there. So there's a very big cognitive dissonance in terms of the way that it's people are reacting to it.
And Angie, some of the analysis I read also talked about a real generational divide. Is that something that you see as well? Can you elaborate on that?
Big time. We have a very, very young population in Nigeria. I think something like 60 to 70% of our population, which is over 200 million, we're the most populous nation in Africa, is under the age of 30. So we have a very, very young population, and the older generation are very much used to sort of these under the radar measures that are used to sort of take care of massive systemic problems, things like bribing police, things like, and then you have the younger generation who are now seeing, society for what it is, and they are incredibly dissatisfied with, the fact that basic infrastructure, basic funding, basic things like police protection aren't taken into account by the government. They're tired of the corruption. They're incredibly sort of, they're questioning the status quo, especially those who have come from Western backgrounds or who have gone to school abroad or who have lived abroad. They're finding themselves very uncomfortable within their own nations.
Angie, so great to have your perspective on this. I recommend everybody subscribe to Angie Speaks on YouTube and also check out the Low Society podcast, where you all were gracious enough to have me as a guest last week. So great to have you, Angie. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good one. Thank you.
You too.
Coming up, the Daily Caller, they've got a hold of some new Hunter Biden text messages that don't seem to bode well for the vice president's son, and the media is trying to set a new standard about how we approach that story. We're going to tell you more when Rising continues.